CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode with me, Prof Moyo, on Conversations on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. We're doing this here at the Wits Business School. This morning, I'm really excited to be joined by Julia Standish-White from the Bridgespan Group in South Africa. She's the director there. Julia, welcome to the episode.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you so much. And I really, when I read your report, the new report, How African NGOs Grow, I was excited to have this conversation because the Bridgespan Group has been doing lots of research. And I think, for the past 5 or so years that I started interacting with your colleagues and yourselves, there have been a series of various research reports that you have brought out. And some of them have really made some, what I would call, impactful, findings. I'm thinking, for example, just after COVID, one of your report reported that high net worth individuals in Africa had given, is it 10 times, 7 times they had ever done in 10 years. And now you've just produced a new report, which is looking at, how African NGOs, in essence, sustain themselves and the challenges that they face. And you have at least 5 findings there, and I wanted us to start there, and then we'll come back to the work of Bridgespan Group in Africa and South Africa, for that matter. But let's start there. I mean, you're reading as a group of the civil society and the subset of the NGO sector in Africa in general. What's your take at the moment, and what are your findings telling us?
Sure. So I think they were telling us a few things. One was that Africa is not a one-size-fits-all. The growth story for NGOs in Africa is not a one-size-fits-all. Even when we started the research, we had to ask a lot of questions about what does being a big NGO mean? What size does your budget need to be considered big? And one of the findings there was that looks very different in different countries. Yeah. And we only studied 3 countries, as you know, but even across those 3, it looked different. So I think that context matters for NGOs. And then I think another second big piece that we found was that there is scarcity of funding for these African NGOs. While these ones have managed to grow, it's hard to do so. And there's, of the funding that's coming to Africa, only some of it is going to local NGOs. Yeah. And there's a lot of funding going elsewhere, not going to Africa. And then the third piece I'd say is that even despite this funding scarcity, there are NGOs who are making a real difference and who are growing to amazing sizes and doing impactful work in light of all of these challenges.
Yeah. And I think some of the other things, and I want us to come back and maybe take each of those one by one. But I think the other thing that your report makes is that most of the African NGOs are still dependent on international funding, whether it's bilateral or foundation or philanthropy, which I think we have always known. So it's not really like a surprising finding. However, at some point, I would want us to refer to other research that's coming out of EPIC Africa, for example, which is showing that there's an increase in individual giving from Africa, which I think speaks to your other finding, that in some countries, for example, in South Africa, you are seeing a growth of domestic finding compared to the other countries as well. So maybe if we look at the first issue around the dependency on international funding, and you started 3 countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Can we maybe put some detail into that finding? Sure. The one on dependence on international funding.
Sure. So we interviewed 33 NGOs to have a structured conversation around their funding models and funding sources. And we asked 2 questions. One was, what was your first pivotal grant? And there we just wanted to understand what was the grant you received that maybe it wasn't super big, but it set you on a path to growth. Yeah. And then after that, we also asked, and what is your primary source of funding now? And for both of those questions, almost all of our 33 NGOs across the countries named international sources of funding. So I think that was the one that for what set them on the path to growth, and then what continues to sustain them is international.
Yeah.
And across those two types of funding, it was a mix of bilateral, multilateral, as you mentioned, and international philanthropy. So I think that was the one piece, was just that it's international sources.
Yeah.
Some of that was unrestricted or flexible funding, but a lot of it was more restricted, programmatic funding. And organizations noted that, without that, they likely wouldn't have gotten to the growth trajectory that they were on.
Yeah.
So they need that international funding.
Yeah, and from the philanthropy side, I noticed that there were a couple of big donors that kept showing up. Your Bill and Melinda Gates, your Elmer Philanthropies, I think MacArthur,
Yes.
and among others. And it was fascinating for me to see the names of recipients, because they are not our usual recipients that we would have looked at. Because if we had looked at, for example, the Ford Foundation, Mott and others, the list would have looked completely different, and the nature of funding would also have looked completely different. There will be more, core funding as opposed to project funding. I looked in the report to see if I could find somewhere where there's reference to the Build grant,
Yes.
which is what the Ford Foundation
Yes.
was doing, but I didn't find that. I'm curious as to why there wasn't reflection on some of the what I could see as emerging progressive funding models that we are seeing, Mackenzie Scott and many others. So maybe we could talk a bit about, and I know that Bridgespan might be, involved in also doing lots of research around some of these new emerging models. Do you see those models, having an impact or maybe influencing the nature of funding in Africa going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and it was actually a specific hypothesis we initially wanted to test, because in our US sort of parallel of this research of how nonprofits get really big, they've refreshed that work a few times, and in the last occasion of refreshing it, they found that philanthropy has started to be a source of growth capital for large nonprofits, and a big part of that is things like the Mackenzie Scott giving, and those big unrestricted gifts that are able to catalyze nonprofits. I think in our research, we certainly found that there were select organizations that had received some of that. So I can remember a couple of organizations in Nigeria mentioning the Build grant as something where they could develop their back office infrastructure, for example. I think it was maybe Leap Africa. So they did mention that. I would say in what we heard across the 33, we didn't hear that those funding practices were shifting how funding was happening across the continent. But what we did find, and it links to our fourth funding around the role of that flexible or sort of core funding, was that even if it was small, it was really critical for the organizations who received it.
A couple of years back, and I think it was either 2012 or 2013, and the subsequent report was done, I think, around 2017 or 18. So the Foundation Center and EGAC, the African Grantmakers Affinity Group, released a report that tracked a lot of international funding, mainly from US foundations. And at that time, it showed that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was the number one foundation that gave at least 70% of foundation funding from the US to African NGOs. It was followed by the Ford Foundation, which gave 4%. I wonder whether in your writings and in your research, since the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation kept showing up, what are the implications of including it in your analysis and excluding it in your analysis?
So I think, interestingly, particularly if we think about the South African context and the organizations that met the big criteria in South Africa, which was having a budget size of $5 million or higher, a lot of the organizations there were focused on HIV. And obviously that's evolved as the epidemic has evolved in terms of, just purely treatment to now more prevention, focus on key populations. But I think BMGF came up quite a bit there in terms of supporting HIV response, as did many of the multilaterals like PEPFAR, for example. And then it came up again in Nigeria for some of the organizations, again related to health. I think there's an organization, Nigeria Health Watch. They mentioned that they get a lot of their funding from the Gates Foundation. And I'm sure there were some in Kenya, although there was a real mix across the Kenyan NGOs that we studied, and maybe less of the Gates funding. So I think there is definitely that health focus, which is unsurprising, and particularly HIV in South Africa. And then for, I guess, those who didn't have that funding were maybe focused on other areas.
Yeah. So the reason I'm asking is because of that dominance. So it is in the health sector, so it's expected because that's where they focus most of their funding, and maybe even in agriculture, etc. So in the space of human rights, democracy, and stuff, one of the biggest, and this is why I'm getting to this, one of the biggest donors in South Africa and in Africa used to be the Open Society Foundations.
Yeah.
And, as of the last couple of years, as you know, they've been changing their strategies, and as of last year, they started closing down some of their programs, including the South Africa office, for example, the Southern Africa office, etc., and moving into cluster programs. And that has had a huge impact on a number of those organizations. And I'm getting to a point where I'm thinking, this growth that we're talking about, is it real growth?
Yeah.
Is it real growth?
It's an excellent question.
Yeah.
And we really hope to find more of a mix of types of organizations, of sectors across these big ones that we interviewed. And I think in South Africa, we hope there would be sort of bigger education-focused NGOs, as you say, sort of more of these social justice organizations. But at that $5 million criteria, there were a number of organizations that I think just fell short. And so I think you're right in that even, are we defining growth in the right way? There's a question there. And equally, how many barriers to growth exist that there are a number of really high impact organizations that have not met that threshold yet? But that's not to say that they don't need funding to grow even more. And so maybe then it starts to point to some of the funding practices as well that are perhaps inhibiting their growth.
Yeah. And then linked to that was one of the findings around domestic resourcing. And what I found there interestingly was that in the domestic resource mobilization strategies of most of the groups that you studied, it was more of diversification. But diversification which still lent them or lended them in almost like dependency sources. Either you are diversifying to corporates, you are diversifying to foundations. And I didn't see the alternative and creative ways in which NGOs today are trying to, have a blended finance approach, for example, income generating activities. I didn't see that. Is it specific to the sector, or this was just something that did not come out strongly? Because I know that currently most organizations, as much as they might still be receiving more than 80, maybe 75% of their funding from international sources or from philanthropy, there's an attempt to also have entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship on the side, or have one of the arms of the organization to generate income. But I found that lacking in these in the organizations that you studied.
It's a really interesting point, and I think it ties in a little bit. To the final finding where we talk about organizations trying to broaden their revenue mix. I think we played around and thought about, is it a diversification piece? But to be honest, it was not for a large portion of the organizations we studied, and B, even if they were able to generate some of those income streams, they were small. And so we were talking about, the main revenue sources, and it wasn't at a level of that. But there were certainly some, I think, one organization that really stuck out, Ubuntu Pathways in South Africa. They spoke about their shift away from more restricted funding to more flexible funding, even though that meant they had to lower their budget size. And when they spoke about their ideal funding model, they spoke about that being much more self-generated through some enterprises so that they didn't need to rely on philanthropy anymore. Similarly, I think another organization in Kenya, Adeso, they also spoke about trying to generate some earned revenue so that they had, as you say, sort of, more innovative ways to sustain themselves.
So I think, for me, as I read the report, I kept thinking about, you know, the space that civil society operates in. And one of the issues that I think is important is the operating environment. The operating environment is so crucial and important for CSOs to do their work, but also for them to be able to sustain themselves. So the question of the operational environment and sustainability is important. And I'm thinking about how, you know, your findings can speak to the environment, whether it is restrictive, whether it is enabling, and there have been so many studies around that, looking at the enabling environment for civil society in Africa. I just want us to bring the question of sustainability to the operational environment. What's your take? I don't think the report goes deep into discussing those synergies.
Yeah, it was certainly something we wanted to understand before we even started to study specific organizations. And I think we had a few general findings. One was, I think in some ways Kenya is still viewed as the donor darling or a hub of CSO activity in Africa. I think it's got a more amenable operating environment. And we even found a lot of organizations headquartered there that then have a footprint much outside of Kenya as well. I think Nigeria is sort of more on the track towards having a more amenable operating environment. When we spoke to a couple of funders and organizations, they spoke about how difficult it's been for Nigerian organizations to scale, how difficult it's been for them to secure the prime grantee role, you know, from bilateral, multilateral funding. And then in South Africa, I think it's interesting, organizations and a couple of experts we spoke to mentioned that it is an easier operating environment, that we have a robust registration process, and it's quite easy to register as a nonprofit. Obviously, the mandating of corporate social responsibility helps for that to be a revenue stream. And as we saw with the finding on domestic funding, I think there is government funding flowing that is fueling the growth of those organizations. So I'd say it differs a bit across those three. That obviously is 3 out of 54 countries. I think then it varies a lot. But I think even all of that is to say, I think there could still be much more funding flowing from outside Africa into Africa for these organizations, and there are still barriers to that. And I think some of that speaks to the funding practices of international funders in particular.
I mean, what informed the choice of the 3 countries?
So it was a couple of things. One was there are 3 big economies in South Africa with some geographic diversity. We also found reason to believe that they were relatively mature social sectors, and so we would be able to find organizations that had met that criteria for being big, even though it looked different in Nigeria compared to the other 2 countries. And that was it really. It's just the maturity of the social sectors, geographic diversity, size of the economies. And to be clear, it was difficult even to surface names of NGOs in those 3 countries. I think if we did a similar study in other countries in Africa, it would be even harder to find them, which is not to say it wouldn't be important, but data availability was a big factor for the research as well.
I was actually asking because one of the things that we have come to know, at least as CAPSI and through our research, is that it's easy, not relatively easy, but it's much doable and easy to do research in those 3 countries than it is, for example, to do in Francophone countries.
Yes.
And, just wondering if you were to do a similar study in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, maybe Mali, we'll be surprised at what we'll probably find out. Because when we started doing some work on philanthropy, in the beginning, it seemed as if there was no data, philanthropy was very low in those countries. And to our surprise, when we started doing studies in those countries, we realized that actually there's a lot of information and philanthropy is already entrenched, which was completely different from what our studies in Anglophone countries were kind of leading us to believe. So I don't know whether you have plans of doing similar studies in those countries.
I think it's a really important call out of a potential blind spot in the research of, focusing on the Anglophone countries. So I think it's not a capability we have in terms of the ability to go deep in the Francophone countries, but I think it would be an incredibly valuable exercise to understand, as you say, those sectors that may well be vibrant and that we don't understand.
And some of the groups that you studied at DESO, for example, are part of this bigger debate on localization, approximation, decolonizing the way aid is done. I'm trying to think about, how you would have reflected that on the report in terms of the debates, because, on the one side you can see this flow of resources to these particular regions, and some research in the past has shown that, the aid architecture is designed in such a way that, money would follow colonial patterns and colonial histories. So you would see that lots of Anglophone funders will end up funding in Anglophone countries. And the same would apply to the Francophone, Lusophone. And that already brings a lot of issues and baggage around the architecture of aid. And so as we are looking at the growth of these African NGOs, what is the discussion we should be having regarding these debates around approximation, localization, and decolonizing the aid architecture?
It's a really important question, and one that we wanted to make sure the research spoke to. So one of those was reflected in our design choices. We only wanted to study African headquartered, African-led organizations. So we weren't interested in studying INGOs that operate in Africa that may have a much bigger budget size. So that was one exclusion we already made to really shine a light on African NGOs. And then I think the second was to try and highlight some suggestions or considerations for funders to how they could think about localization and being more proximate in their giving more intentionally. And a few of those were, one, just in light of our findings about big looking different in different countries, was to rethink your budget size for defining what is a big enough organization that has a track record or strong enough, absorptive capacity to receive funding. So rethink what that bar is. It might be lower than you think. Secondly, also linked to that track record, think about lowering some of the requirements, or not even lowering, but reconsidering the requirements for what it takes to absorb funding. Can you be more trust-based rather than requiring, ticking a few boxes? The importance of, a third one for funders is the importance of flexible funding, as we spoke about, to be able to think about core capabilities in the organization rather than just needing to be programmatic, but not investing in the bones of the organization. And then a final one was to think about longer grant terms. So we really heard from organizations that the difference between a 1 year grant and a 3 to 5 year grant is considerable. So if funders really want to invest in the growth of these African NGOs, try and think about some of those things in the practices.
I mean, the reason why I'm bringing this issue of localization and local-led development is because there's a recognition that for African NGOs to continue growing and to build their capacity, they have to also contend with the movement of international NGOs some of whom have localized in the African continent, who have hired people from those African NGOs that are meant to be growing. So there's a discussion that needs to be had there, especially for donors and everyone involved, because the growth of these African NGOs will not be sustainable if we don't address the working relations and the movement of international capital, which favors international NGOs who are now stationed in the global south. So it's a discussion that I think your report is bringing it out, but we need to actually ask what are the implications of this, and that's why I was asking earlier on, this growth, how is it growth when there are so many of these things that seem to be taking away from it? But the other thing that you spoke about is the fact that big budgets don't necessarily or always lead to impact. But you were also making a point that it's always, for the groups that you studied, big budgets seemed to help them to achieve most of what they were aiming to. But maybe we can deepen that finding a bit with some examples that you use in the report.
Sure. So I think one thing that's important to note is that for a number of these organizations, particularly with majority of their funding received from restricted sources, so, you know, these organizations focused on HIV that were receiving a lot of PEPFAR funding, when we asked them about another source of funding, many of them didn't have one.
Yeah.
So I think in that case, if we think about a sustainable funding model, if suddenly that PEPFAR funding was to be withdrawn, they would be in a very difficult or precarious position.
Yeah.
So I think that's one is large, and in these cases, this was 50 million plus US dollars. Budget sizes doesn't necessarily equal longevity or sustainability. So I think those were some examples of how that played out. I think then for other organizations maybe that are not necessarily direct service delivery organizations, one organization we spoke to in Kenya, Teaching at the Right Level, Africa, they spoke about how their model is all about capacitating government and institutionalizing their model in the government. And so they don't want to get to a huge budget size. I think they're at 12 million now, and they don't want to get much bigger because that's not part of their impact model. So again, that's the right size for them to be creating impact, but they don't want to scale further than that. So I think it's both recognizing that those organizations that look really big may not have sort of, that core funding that could help to sustain them when they lost other sources of funding. If I think about a couple of others that we spoke to, some of them spoke about what it meant when some of their key funders withdrew. There was a funder, an organization in South Africa, Wild Trust. They spoke about how during COVID, the South African government withdrew their funding and they had to rethink their whole funding model. And so again, there I think, needing to unlock other sources of funding became important so that they could remain big. And I think also just last point is to say, I'm sure that there are many, many other organizations that because they weren't at the 1 million USD budget mark that we didn't study, which is not to say that they are not driving a lot of change, but perhaps more proximate in how they're orienting, more sort of partnership driven. And those are powerful models for impact that, we didn't speak to, but that's not to say they're not doing excellent work.
I mean, earlier I referred to the other report that you did, which you looked at during COVID and how high net worth individuals were giving. In this study of the growth of African NGOs, what did you find as some kind of a trend when it comes to high net worth individuals?
So I think it's important to distinguish between sort of international HNWIs and local. I think we found that for some of the 33 organizations we interviewed, that high net worth individual funding from outside of Africa was a revenue source, not a primary revenue source, not significant, but something that either had helped in that first pivotal grant or was one of the sources of many that is sustaining them now. Interestingly, of the 33 we studied, none of them noted high net worth individuals within Africa as being a big funding source for them. We asked about African philanthropies, we asked about other sources of local funding, and outside of what we spoke about already, the South African sort of government, corporate funding, we didn't hear much at all about high net worth individual giving within Africa for these African NGOs.
Yeah, but I don't know whether it was your report or other people's report that showed that most of these high net worth individuals actually give either to governments or they give to outside entities. I think I might have read one of your reports that actually gave that kind of finding. But you also spoke about some of the tactics that NGOs use to specifically access international funding. Can we talk about those approaches and tactics?
I think one thing that's important to note, we really chose the word tactics intentionally because it reflects the need to shape shift almost or use certain language to attract international funding. We don't want to believe that organizations must do this, but recognizing the scarcity of funding that there is, they almost need to conform to some of these international funding practices. So a few things we noted were one, establishing international registration. So either becoming a US 501c3 entity or perhaps registering in the UK was something that helped them to unlock more funding. Another one was thinking about investing in targeted fundraising capabilities for particular sources of funding. So some organizations have a particular high net worth individual funding department,
Yeah.
or bilateral and multilateral funding department, philanthropy, and they focus on looking after those funders and securing that funding and all of the reporting requirements that come with that.
Yeah.
So dedicated capabilities for that. And then another one was thinking about first being a sub-grantee in some of these big grant agreements to then sort of establish enough of a track record to go on to be the prime grantee.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one, which I think is mentioned often, is just the piece around establishing personal relationships and growing sort of networks to unlock funding. And a couple of the organizations spoke about specific networks that they'd been in, either sort of their leader as being in a sort of individual network, or their, other organizations. I think one that was mentioned was a group called Big Bang Philanthropy, and how that unlocked different funding relationships for them that they could then translate into significant sources of revenue.
Yeah, I mean, we teach a module here on fundraising, the fundamentals and the principles of fundraising, and we pay a lot of attention to those issues that you have raised, and in particular the last one, which is around networking, we call it friend raising, because then, without friend raising, chances are you won't be able to raise any funds. But the other thing that you spoke to are the skills and competencies. I know you are alluding to it when you say the specific units within, but were there specific skills that you found which were useful in unlocking these resources?
I can clearly remember the CEO of CIFOR ICRAF speaking about, to compete with other global entities, we need to be able to write about our impact, report on our impact, apply for grants in a way that can compete with all of them. So I think that the skills to be able to distill your impact narrative and report on the outcomes that you have is very important. I think that's definitely one. I think that ability to find alignment with funders, even if it means not changing what you're doing, but finding a way to articulate what you work on and how that intersects with what the funders' priority issue areas or areas of interest are. I think those are some of them. And then perhaps to partner effectively, I think is also another important one.
So Julia, what do you hope this study is likely to achieve in the sector, firstly, but also for policymakers? Because as much as we are looking at NGOs and maybe donors, there's also, the policy makers who actually set the parameters within which these two entities actually operate. And in fact, NGOs and civil society exist specifically to make particular changes in a particular environment. So what do you hope to achieve with the findings?
So I think the first objective really is to amplify the impact and the growth stories of these African NGOs, the ones that have managed to grow and sustain themselves, and hopefully inspire others who have similar growth inspiration. So to shine a light on those growth stories. I think the second is the piece we were speaking about trying to raise considerations for funders on how to be more proximate in their giving. And I think then more broadly for policymakers, maybe some of it is to highlight the critical role that NGOs can play in improving key outcomes. If I think about some of the organizations in South Africa, what they've done for health, what they've done for education, and many of them already work in an integrated way. Smart Start, for example, what they've done for ECD in South Africa. And so for policymakers to think about partnering closely with some of these organizations that have a sense of how to solve these problems, but can't do it alone at scale. So how can they work together in an integrated way to then address some of the most pressing social problems?
So, I mean, enough about the report. For those that don't know much about the Bridgespan Group, can we talk about that firstly at a global level?
Sure.
What is it? What does it do? What is its mission? What does it seek to achieve? How long has it been in existence? What is its geographic footprint, etc., etc.?
Sure, with pleasure. So the Bridgespan Group was founded over 20 years ago in the US, in Boston, and since then has grown to have 3 offices in the US, New York, Boston, and San Francisco, and a satellite office in Washington, and have a more global footprint. So we opened in Mumbai in India a number of years ago, and now have a satellite office in Delhi there, and then here in South Africa in 2019, so coming up on 5 years ago now, with the goal of sort of servicing Africa more broadly. And then most recently, we've opened a Singapore office. So we're growing. There's probably about 400 employees across the organization. And really, Bridgespan is a nonprofit that seeks to support philanthropists, NGOs, investors to accelerate their impact, all in service of moving towards a world where there is more equity and justice. And so we focus on providing advisory support to those sources of philanthropic capital. How can they give that capital more equitably, more impactfully? And then for mission-driven leaders of NGOs, how can they think about their strategies and how they implement their programs in a way that really is aligned with their impact objectives? So that's one piece of the work, is the advisory piece. Then we also do work related to what we've been speaking about insight generation. So this we see as a broader focus on contributing to the social sector, shining light on important trends, on practices that may need to shift, things that are important for funders, for NGOs, for impact investors alike to be aware of. And then the final piece of our work that has been growing outside of the US is what we call our leadership development offering. And so in the US, that's called Leading for Impact, and it's for leaders, capacity building for nonprofit leaders to grow their skill sets. And then in Mumbai, a number of years ago, we opened this under the name of the Bridgespan Nonprofit Development Program, which is cohort-based learning to think about focusing on how to really get clear on your impact and strengthen your team. And excitingly, we're going to be launching that in Africa from early next year. So cohorts of NGOs that can get support and targeted coaching from Bridgespaners on how to amplify their impact.
And then in South Africa, what are the core programmatic interventions or areas that the South Africa office is focusing on? I know it will be aligned to the global nature and work of Bridgespan, but there's a particular context here and also in the African region. Are there any specifics that you want to pull out from what the office here is doing?
So exactly as you said, it's aligned to those areas of work that I described. I'd say that since our inception, we've had a strong focus on this insight generation, as we've been speaking about, highlighting, for example, disparities in funding to African-led NGOs versus internationally led NGOs. We recently published a refresh of that piece, which actually showed that there is more money going to African NGOs now, which is exciting and important. We published some research on funder collaboratives in Africa, on impact investing in Africa, and we're busy starting at the moment trying to understand specifically in South Africa corporate giving. How does that work? What does the landscape of that look like? So I think those are the research pieces. On more of the advisory side, we have worked with a number of African NGOs on their strategies. These have mostly been in Africa more broadly as opposed to just South African NGOs. So a number in Kenya and others in East Africa. And then when it comes to philanthropists, we've worked more on international, global north-based philanthropists and helping them to think through their investment portfolio or strategy for giving in Africa. So how can we advise on how to think about high-impact organizations to invest in, or how even to think about that portfolio?
So I know that you've also collaborated with the Africa Philanthropy Forum. Maybe we can speak to some of your collaborations, but I wanted to spotlight the Africa Philanthropy Forum because I think you've done a couple of reports with them.
Definitely, that's a really important partnership. And when we released that report on disparities in giving to African NGOs, it was in partnership with APF. And it was linked to that they then started their, is it Start Point, the platform for finding or surfacing other African NGOs. So that's a really important collaboration that we have for research and just for another space that we see, or channel for disseminating our research.
Okay, but do you have any other collaborations other than that which you have forged in the African context?
I think we continue to remain focused on collaborating with many others. I think for our research, this Funder Collaboratives research piece was supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through their South Africa office. So there's collaborations there. But other than that, I think we're still, getting a sense of that landscape and then finding targeted partnerships where they work. I think one other thing that I'll call out is another piece of research we recently published was related to community-driven change and the importance of communities who are driving their own change and where that might not even look like a formalized NGO always. How can funders be aware of that change and be supportive of that? And that really went deep into communities in South Africa and in Kenya and also in India, and trying to surface some practices there. So less of a collaboration with other entities, but I think there's a number of funders who are interested in that topic and who hopefully will take inspiration and learning from the products of that research.
I mean, for NGOs that are hearing you for the first time and they want to approach Bridgespan, especially for the advisory services, how do they do that?
So they can just reach out to one of us on LinkedIn or to our office, and we can have a conversation. We really like to underscore the fact that we know, especially in this report, that NGOs are operating in funding scarcity, and so we only want to support them with advisory if it really makes sense to them. But that doesn't mean we're not always open to a first conversation or series of conversations to think about what might make sense. And even if that might make sense, to focus on a few things and then come for advisory support later or join one of these cohorts that we were speaking about. But they can reach out and we can certainly speak about what might make sense for them.
Is there anything that you want to highlight which you might have left out in terms of the research pieces, products, but also Bridgespan Group as a whole?
I think the one thing that I come back to with this research that I would like to underscore is, as I mentioned, this came off the back of a number of articles around how nonprofits get big in the US context. And it strikes me time and time again how different this study was in so many ways. In the US context, the threshold for big was $50 million US. Here we used 1 million and 5 million. And in the US context, they talk about securing a primary source of revenue, a secondary source. And all of that is to assume almost an abundance of funding. Whereas in the African NGO context for funding models, I think what we learned is that that's a luxury that many organizations don't have. To be able to talk about primary, secondary, it's just about finding the money to really sustain themselves and to grow to a threshold that makes sense. So I think that would just be the biggest piece for me, is that I think this research, hopefully, our goal was to start talking about an important topic. As you mentioned, the conversation's nowhere near over. But I think just recognizing that Africa is a very different context. Even within that, this was only 3 countries. And so we need to keep asking these questions and keep grounding ourselves in this context.
I mean, I'm really intrigued by that, because when you spoke about the pivotal grant and then, how then these groups then continue to be dependent on international funders, it raised one of the principles in fundraising, which is that once you receive the first grant, you then try and maintain relations to a point where you actually upgrade that grant, so that that grant becomes much bigger, but it also becomes that donor becomes a recurring donor, time and again, to a point where the donor does not just provide money, but they end up becoming an ambassador, a voice for the organization. And that didn't seem to come out really clearly as whether or not these groups are doing that. So as you were ending and talking about that, it really dawned on me that maybe one of the pieces that we should probably be taking out of the report is the need for these organizations to really utilize some of these pivotal grants and build on them to build long-term relationships. And in fundraising, we talk about the donor development. So donors at times give you a first grant, partly to understand how you work, to get used to your work, and then over time, if they are really interested, they stay, and then you can upgrade them to what you are now talking, the prime donors and all of that. And we seem not to have that. Am I right in
It's
in
an
saying that?
interesting observation. I think there might have been a handful of organizations
Yeah.
for which that was true, but I think the point broadly resonates. And also, when we spoke about first pivotal, I think perhaps organizations had received that first even smaller grant, but they didn't categorize that as their first pivotal grant. But I think it's a really interesting point. Yes.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's talk about Julia. Who is Julia, and how did you end up in this particular sector?
Sure. So
It's a sector of passion, they say. They say it's not a sector where you come in to make money. So how did you end up here?
It's definitely a sector of passion. I think there's a lot of excellent work that energizes me. So I grew up in a small town near Joburg called Witbank or Emalahleni, and then moved to Joburg for my high school years. And I studied in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town. I studied psychology and Xhosa. I really wanted to be a psychologist at that point. So I think I was looking to make a difference, but more sort of in the therapy space. And then I finished my honors in psychology and tried to apply for masters in psychology to become a clinical psychologist, which is very competitive and requires a lot of life experience. And I think realized between getting rejected by various programs, but also thinking a bit more about that profession, that maybe that wasn't for me. So then I went to do a master's to try and sort of broaden my expertise. So I went to the University of Oxford, where I did a master's in evidence-based social intervention and policy evaluation, so understanding more large-scale programs for impact. And that helped me to see, firstly, that maybe academia was not the place for me. I wanted to be sort of doing more, but that these broader sort of focus on social interventions made sense. So when I finished that, I came back to South Africa to start my career, first at an economics consultancy firm, where I was between sort of their behavioral economics and then health practices, so focused on consulting, but providing support to sort of social behavior change campaigns and research work in the health space. And then I felt that I still wanted to do more sort of strategic consulting work, but very much in the development space or in the social sector. And it was around that time that I learned of Bridgespan, because it was still quite new in the South African space. So I learned that they were hiring, and I was super excited. So I made an application and joined Bridgespan as a consultant, and then have been there for the last 3 years, and became a manager last year. And I love it. It's tough work, but it's very fulfilling. There's amazing people who we work with, both on the client side and within our own team. So really enjoy it.
I mean, so just behind you is a platform called Kisima, which refers to a well. But we chose this Swahili word because we thought philanthropy is that well which nourishes so many people in their different contexts. And as far as I've known, there's no one who doesn't have a philanthropy story of how they themselves are either philanthropists or they've benefited from philanthropy. Do you have one?
Yes, I do. So my master's degree was funded by the Oxford Weidenfeld Trust, and so that was a wealthy individual who founded the Weidenfeld. Louis Weidenfeld was his name, and funded my whole master's program, which had an accompanied leadership program. And similarly, my honors degree in South Africa was funded by the Mandela Rhodes Foundation, which I see as being one of the most fantastic experiences that I gained in terms of the learnings from others who are funded by that program and the leadership program that they provide. So I think in both of those ways, philanthropy has supported my education and broadening of how I just think about how I show up and use that education in terms of the leadership programming that they provided.
Yeah, fantastic. Because, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what I've learned through my own examples and talking to other people, I meet every person that I talk to. They've received philanthropy funded by somebody to do particular education, training, etc. I was funded by the Mellon Foundation to do my PhD. Wow. And then I also received funding from the Mott Foundation to go and do a fellowship in the US. But what I found interesting is that I've never heard from the Mellon Foundation to actually say, we funded this guy, look at where he has moved from his studies to setting up all these institutions and becoming one of the leading authorities in philanthropy. I just find that fascinating that the people who funded me have never actually followed up to see the kind of work that I've done. And they invested a lot of money. The Mellon funding was not a small amount. You know, for 4 years I received funding from the Mellon Foundation here at Wits. But I've never heard from any of them saying, look at that person that we funded.
Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot about your own donor.
I can't say get personal reach outs, but I do keep in touch with the Mandela Rhodes Foundation. But I think you make a good point of you're perpetuating philanthropy in many other ways. So it's keeping that cycle going, even if the source of it for you isn't, you know, keeping a finger on the pulse on that.
But my point really is that at some point I want to do either a series of conversations with people who are funded by specific donors to do certain things and see whether there's relationships that have been kept over time. Because I think those are very important to demonstrate the impact. We always argue that philanthropy is probably not making the dent that it's supposed to make, given the high levels of poverty and inequality. And yet some of us are living examples of the impact that philanthropy has made. And I can assure you, each and every person who has been to higher learning, etc., at one point or the other, they've been supported by somebody. On that note, Julia, thank you so much for joining us. I'm hoping that you will join us in Victoria Falls, where we will be looking at the next frontiers in African philanthropy. And I think some of the research that Bridgespan Group has been doing will be useful as part of those conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was Julia Standish-White from the Bridgespan Group. She works there as the manager. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.